I give you Vijay Prashad.
Thanks a lot, Mary. It's great to be with you. I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, as Mary and Cole have instructed me. The theme, of course, for us is the question of this pressure campaign that's being brought by various countries against the People's Republic of China. Mary began by quoting from President Joe Biden's United Nations speech, where Biden, I think quite unequivocally, directly said, we don't want a Cold War with China. That statement should be welcomed because it sets a certain platform. By the way, for those who would dismiss a statement like that, I would just like to inform you, it's much better that Biden said we don't want a Cold War than if Biden had announced United States is commencing military operations against China. So given the choice between one or the other statement, both cliches of a different kind, I'd much rather have the cliche that says we don't want a Cold War. Because after all, this is something that the people of the United States and the 192 other member states of the United Nations must hold the United States to, because he's said this, in a sense, although there is no legal foundation, he said this on the record. There is video of Joe Biden saying we don't want a Cold War. Now, thanks, Joe. Thanks for that. But what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Because in the week before Biden made those comments, he, after all, announced, along with Scott Morrison of Australia and Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, a new military arrangement, very clumsily called AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. Now, I've looked into AUKUS fairly, extensively, and it's quite clear that AUKUS, more than a military arrangement, is an arms deal. And we can get to that in the question and answer. But essentially, it was a mechanism, or it is a mechanism, for the United States and the UK to sell billions of dollars worth of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. But just the week before, they had cut this deal. Now, Scott Morrison of Australia, Boris Johnson of the UK, Joe Biden, they didn't talk about China directly when they talked about AUKUS, but the BBC was not fooled. The BBC headline was, UK, Britain, Australia create military pact to squeeze China. They said it directly. Just the week after Mr. Biden made his speech, he welcomed 3 world leaders to a meeting. The world leaders were Mr. Suga of Japan, Scott Morrison again of Australia, and Narendra Modi of India. Well, because they have a platform initially put together in 2007, revived in 2017, called the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Arrangement. The Quad is, by its very own admission, set up by Australia, India, Japan, and the United States to put military pressure on China. So before Mr. Biden made his speech where he said we don't want a Cold War, they announced AUKUS. And after Mr. Biden made his speech, he held the Quad. So it's confusing. How do you not want a Cold War, and at the same time you're building up a maximum pressure campaign against China? Let's develop this further. A maximum pressure campaign against China. The United States, United Kingdom, and other countries, including Germany, strikingly, have been conducting so-called freedom of navigation exercises along Chinese waters, in fact, into contested waters. Very provocative action. United Kingdom sent a carrier group led by an aircraft carrier called HMS Queen Elizabeth, which has 600 US Marines on board. And they essentially skirted Chinese territorial waters, very provocative exercise. Plus, the United States has been building up its military capacity in the so-called Indo-Pacific Command region. This includes bases from Hawaii, Guam, Okinawa in Japan, the Philippines, and so on, and arming allied countries, providing new kinds of equipments to Taiwan, South Korea, and now, of course, nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Freedom of navigation exercises are interesting, and we can come back to that as well. It begs the question, are these actually legal by international law? The United States is not a signatory of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and yet it claims to be, on behalf of the so-called international community, maintaining sea lanes open, not only threatening China and making accusations against China, but also Russia. Because you might know the US and its allies have been conducting so-called freedom of navigation exercises in the Arctic Circle and in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea. So around Eurasia, the United States has taken it upon itself to conduct these so-called freedom of navigation exercises that put pressure on China and Russia, making the implicit and actually quite explicit claim that China and Russia are blocking international sea lanes. That's the accusation. And that's why these powers feel the need to run their boats into and near Russian and Chinese waters. By the way, there is considerable, a century plus precedent for this activity. And you might know this phrase from when you studied history in high school. The precedent is, of course, the phrase gunboat diplomacy. You may have known about gunboat diplomacy because the United States would take its ships, park off the coast of Nicaragua, for instance, in the 1920s, and fire off a few rounds of cannon until the Nicaraguans would say, okay, send an American to be our president. By the way, I'm not making this up. This is actually Nicaragua's history. There was actually a US national who was installed as the president of Nicaragua. That's called gunboat diplomacy. What we see now, this freedom of navigation, pretty close to that. So, Mr. Biden, we have that on the record. Additionally, several defense appropriation bills have very chilling language. They say things like fight and prevail in a future conflict with China. The need to counter the increasing threat of China. This is all from Pentagon documents. In the Pentagon documents, there's far more openness. The need to prevail in a conflict over China. That's what it says in a Pentagon document from 2020. I think she was Undersecretary of State Michelle Fonteroy makes this statement. We must prevail in a war against China. It's chilling language. So what no Cold War are you proposing to have us believe? That the United States is not doing a Cold War. On the other hand, there is a maximum military pressure campaign on China. Add to that military pressure campaign, there is a trade war against China, which was openly executed by His Royal Highness Donald Trump when he was the president. That maximum economic pressure campaign has not been reduced by Joe Biden. Except, of course, just a few days ago, Commerce Secretary Raimondo said we will be trading with China in a normal basis. How do you do both things at the same time? The Biden administration is remarkable. They want to do everything at the same time. Have a trade war with China, trade normally with China. Have no Cold War against China, prosecute a Cold War against China. I don't know how they do it. They must be, they're amazing people in this Biden administration. They literally, can do two things at the same time, my friends, and two contradictory things at the same time, even more miraculous. The third element of this Cold War is actually the most chilling, and this is where I would like to take a few minutes of your time. This is the information war against China. This is a very, very sophisticated operation. Now, like many of you, I've studied the information war campaigns conducted not only by the United States, but by other powers. And there is a pattern that develops. Just to remind you, because this is now some time back, but you will remember after Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army entered Kuwait, you will remember that there was a hearing in, I think, the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think that was where the hearing was. Cole may remember, I may be wrong, but it was a congressional hearing. A young woman sat before the elected officials of the United States government, and this young woman said, I have just returned from Kuwait. I was an eyewitness to Iraqi troops entering Kuwaiti hospitals and throwing children out of incubators, babies out of incubators, and taking the incubators back to Iraq. Very chilling testimony from this young woman. Very effective testimony. Based on that testimony, the administration of George H.W. Bush, repeating that testimony over and over again, drummed up support for the United States' entry into Saudi Arabia and eventually that war against Iraq. Turns out, very soon thereafter, that the young woman who was there before Congress was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington, and she had not been to Kuwait in many years. She had been prepped by a public relations company in Washington, D.C. called Hill and Knowlton. Hill and Knowlton had taken a contract from the Kuwaiti government essentially to build up support for the war. That's the way the information war works. And by the time it was exposed that Hill and Knowlton, a very sophisticated PR company, had used a young woman's testimony to build up support for the war, it was too late. The war had taken place. And in fact, I think one of the limitations of Colin Powell was that they didn't hire a company like Hill and Knowlton. Instead, he sat with a ridiculous looking test tube and said, look, this is the weapons of mass destruction. It looked ridiculous. Whatever mea culpa Colin Powell has made since then, he should be ashamed of his performance in front of the United Nations that day, the Security Council, to build up the support for the second bombing of Iraq. We seem to be an awfully gullible lot of people, I must say, because we keep falling for the same storyline. Until 2014 or 2015, most Americans were not even aware of any problem in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and until 2 years ago, didn't even know of the existence of the Uyghur population, had absolutely no idea who the Uyghurs were, let alone the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and others, even though the United States has been in Afghanistan for 20 years. I challenge you, very knowledgeable people who keep up with things, who are activists in the peace movement, many of you who I admire. I challenge you to write down on a piece of paper the 5 different ethnic communities of Afghanistan. I would like to know if you know, and there are many more. These are just the 5 major ethnic communities. I wonder if you can tell me the 3 major languages in Afghanistan. We just don't seem to have the time to actually dig deep into the countries where the United States decides to prosecute war. We are sensitive people, we say no war, but what about the people at the other side and how they get weaponized so easily on behalf of interests that we sometimes don't understand, military interests and so on. Suddenly this whole war drama is built up that there is genocide in Xinjiang. Why do I say this is part of the information war? Well, firstly, look at the sources of the information, where the sources come from. They come from the World Uyghur Congress, which is a body of exiles, very much like Ahmad Chalabi. Do you remember Ahmad Chalabi, or has his name disappeared? He was the man who helped build up support for the Second Gulf War. He was supposed to come. You may not remember the name of Mahmoud Jibril, but Mr. Jibril helped build up support for the war against Libya. There is always a Mahmoud Jibril, there's always an Ahmad Chalabi, and then now there's the World Uyghur Congress. Who knows about them? You'll see a young Uyghur woman appear on television and your heart will sink because she'll talk with great feeling. And it's likely that she and her family have experienced some terrible suffering. It's likely. It's possible. I mean, you can talk to, 1 in 5 people in the United States and they will tell you some horrible thing that has happened to them. They lost health insurance. Their father died in their arms. Their parent was suffocated by the police and killed on the streets of Minneapolis. There are a million horror stories inside the United States. It's not that these stories are not necessarily true. That's not the point I'm making. Don't misunderstand me. The point I'm making is how they are given an extraordinarily loud megaphone without context. They are given a loud megaphone without context and the word genocide is attached to it. Imagine if I, living somewhere in the world, had a similar megaphone and I had the family, the daughter of Michael Garner, and I put her on the air and I said, this is genocide happening in the United States. And I referenced the fact that in the 1950s, a text was produced called We Charge Genocide about the genocidal behavior of the United States government against African Americans. Could I drum up support for a war against the United States? Just think about how that would look. But of course, we don't think about that. We listen to a young Uyghur woman, particularly. They're very clever in how they do this. And your heart sinks and you feel something must be done. But we must understand that these are extraordinarily sophisticated public relations, organizations with a public relations campaign that operates. On top of that, from the Jamestown Institute comes a man who is essentially a Christian right-wing zealot by the name of Adrian Zenj, starts appearing as if he is an expert on the Uyghurs and on Xinjiang, and produces a series of texts arguing about all kinds of things: forced labor, re-education camps, disappearance of people, and so on. It's worthwhile looking to see what the Jamestown Institute is, and I commend you to go and do some research on the Jamestown Institute. I was silenced by the fact that Mr. Adrian Zenj was allowed 1 hour on Democracy Now! To spew these State Department CIA lies. For 1 hour, he was just there talking about this and the other thing in Xinjiang. His record was never mentioned. It was never mentioned that he's a right-wing Christian zealot who works for a State Department CIA outfit called the Jamestown Institute. You'd expect better of a left liberal news portal, but no, he was given virtually an hour to spew nonsense. Or not nonsense, actually, very effective material. Now, again, I want to be clear with you. I'm not saying nothing's happening. There are probably things there that, require a lot of consideration, thought, criticism, and so on. That's a separate issue. The question is, what standard has it raised? Has it attained the standard of genocide? And does it reach into your heart so deeply that you feel like, let's go and conduct an aerial war against China, which, that means against 1.4 billion people? Is that what you're trying to say when you get worked up about this kind of a story or that other story? I want you to consider this, because the way the information war works, it takes elements of what are true, but it amplifies it out of context and touches the heartstrings by yoking it to the term genocide. That's the point I want to make to you. I'm not saying that nothing is happening. I want to be very clear about this. The point is this: decontextualizing of people's experiences and the recontextualizing it into a warlike atmosphere around the word genocide, around the word genocide. That's what I'm talking about, okay? That's the information war. And we have ample evidence of how ghastly the Wurlitzer of the information war has been. It is so difficult to talk sensibly about the Cold War in China because people will come at you with a baseball bat to the head, smashing you and yelling Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Uyghurs, and so on, to silence any statement of criticism against the Cold War, against this hybrid war, impending war, and so on. These are weapons of silencing. But let me ask you a question. Hong Kong, am I seriously to respect the words of the British government, who now are concerned about the democratic rights of the people of Hong Kong, democratic rights which they did not consider in the century plus that Britain ruled Hong Kong up till 1997? Up till 1997, they routinely jailed all the communists, trade unionists, and so on. There were no rights in Hong Kong. There was no elections. Suddenly, the British leave Hong Kong, transfer it back to territorial sovereignty of China, from which they took it during the Opium War. Remember that. It was taken on a long lease. They return it to China, and then they start to complain about democratic rights in Hong Kong. I mean, listen, friends, around the world, people are laughing at this. They are laughing. To hear Chris Patten, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, come on BBC, which is, I have no respect for BBC. Chris Patten comes on BBC, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, to lecture the world about the lack of democratic rights in Hong Kong. Come on, it's absurd. You can't take that seriously. I'm going to leave you now and we can start the questions, but I want to leave you with a thought. The United States was defeated, humiliated in Afghanistan. 20 years of war against a country of about roughly between 2 and 3 dozen million people. About 25, 28 million people. Humiliated in the war against the Taliban. The Taliban, was not a sophisticatedly armed military establishment, but it wiped out the Americans. I mean, it's worse than Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, the armies of the Vietnamese people were being armed by both the Chinese and the Soviets. Who was arming the Taliban? Even if they were getting help from Pakistan, how do you expect them to take on the full might of the US government? They withstood 20 years of war and then they triumphed. It was a humiliation. After that humiliation, how credible is it, do you feel, for the United States to go to war against China? How credible is it? What is going to happen except extreme suffering? There are 100 million members of the Communist Party of China. I don't know if you knew that. That's 1 in 3 people in the United States. That's the size of the Communist Party of China. There's like an 85 to 90% approval rating for the Chinese government for what they've done with poverty alleviation and what they've done with COVID-19. If a bomb drops on Beijing tomorrow, 100% of the Chinese people will be behind their government. It's just like Iran. There's dissent in Iran. You drop one bomb on these old civilizations, everybody is going to galvanize behind their country. What do you want in the world if you want a war against China? It is absurd. I'm going to leave you with the words of one of the great African scientists of our times, Dr. Tedros, who's the head of the World Health Organization. Dr. Tedros, at the beginning of the pandemic, said, we need more collaboration, less confrontation. Tell that to Joe Biden. It's not enough to say no Cold War. Tell him more collaboration, less confrontation. Take a page, not out of Dr. Fauci's book. He's not the only doctor in the world. Take a page out of Dr. Tedros's book. More collaboration, less confrontation. Thanks a lot.